up. Like I say, this house is your house. And I want to say I'm really glad that we could work with Moratorium Now to host our guests today. I think that we need to, I wish the room was filled up because more and more folks in this country need to understand what's going on in other countries, because most of the time it's our country that's responsible for all the havoc. And now recently, our president, he just made it harder to go to Cuba than it was in 1980. And so we need to be aware of these things and know about these things and be able to discuss it and let people in our communities know why it's important to know about other folks and figure out what we can do to liberate ourselves and to liberate everybody else. And so I just want to say it one more time, welcome to the Commons. Our house is your house. Make yourself at home. And I hope we have a great program. Thank you.
Well, I want to welcome everybody out tonight. If everybody can be seated, we can get started. She's not quite on? Okay. Well, I just wanted to welcome everyone out to this Cuba Caravan program. We are here to provide our friends with a platform to talk about what is happening in regard to U.S.-Cuba relations. And of course, this is an annual event, and it's been through the city of Detroit many, many times, the Cuba Caravan. In fact, going back 2 decades, the caravan has been coming through the city of Detroit, and for many years, Moratorium Now Coalition, Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, and others have been honored to host members of the Cuba Caravan. This is very, very important during this period from the standpoint that relations between the United States government, particularly under this administration, and the government in Cuba are strained, to say the least. In fact, relations were reestablished under the previous government of President Barack Obama. However, the embargo or the blockade has never been lifted. This is a very, very important point because many people felt several years ago with the reestablishment of diplomatic relations after a 55 or more year break that this translated into full normalization. It has not. And the embargo is still on, the blockade is still on, the Cuban people are still being denied the right to have normal relations with people inside the United States and other nations. The embargo just does not impact the U.S.-Cuba relations, but it also impacts Cuba's relations with other countries around the world. They have reactivated a section of the Helms-Burton law that was passed many years ago, and that, of course, potentially could damage other nations who have economic, social, and cultural relations with Cuba. They've also put back in place some of the travel restrictions that have been eased in regard to people from the United States traveling to Cuba. So this is why we're here today, and this is why it's important that we escalate our solidarity with Cuba during this period. Also, I want to wish everyone a happy Juneteenth Day. This is June 19th, and I think this is very appropriate that we have the Cuba Caravan here. 154 years ago in Texas, enslaved Africans were formally informed that they were being released from chattel enslavement. Now, this is more than 2 years after the Declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was done on January the 1st of 1863 by the then President Abraham Lincoln. Africans were enslaved in the United States for nearly 250 years. 1619 to 2019 represents 400 years. So this year we're also commemorating the 400th year of the enslavement of Africans in the British colony of Virginia. Now, 400 years, it's a long time. A lot has transpired in 4 centuries. But we're still here, we're still struggling, and we're going to continue to struggle until we reach full liberation. The U.S. 13th Amendment was introduced in the U.S. Congress in January of 1865. It was ratified by the end of that year, December of 1865, which ostensibly emancipated Africans from chattel slavery. Nonetheless, the second part of the 13th Amendment still upholds enslavement for people who are incarcerated. So we have another form of slavery today because we have over 2.5 million people incarcerated inside the United States, and they are subjected to enslavement. So we still have a struggle in terms of the abolition of imprisonment in the United States, which disproportionately impacts African people, people of Latin American descent, Native American people, and working class people in general. There are no billionaires on death row in the United States. The economic system of slavery also connects Africans in this country with Cuba. Slavery flourished in Cuba prior to the arrival of the British in the early 17th century. The Spanish had already been in Cuba and other countries in the Caribbean, and even in Florida, which is considered part of the United States right now, as early as the latter half of the 16th century. So we're connected historically with Cuba in that regard. Also, slavery in the United States would never have ended when it did if there had not been a civil war between 1861 and 1865. And of course, slavery theoretically and legally ended in 1865, and then we had the commencement of what was called Reconstruction in the United States. But in Cuba, slavery did not formally end until 1886. So we're talking about another 21 years after it ended in the United States. So here again, we have a connection with the people of Cuba. There are many, many people of African descent in Cuba, and of course African culture is still very strong in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in other Caribbean island nations, including Haiti, which had a revolution in 1804 and has suffered as a result of that over the last 2 centuries or more. What's also significant about today, June 19th, is that what happened on Capitol Hill with the debate around House Resolution 40, H.R. 40, which is not a new bill. It was introduced initially by Congressman John Conyers, who we all know, formerly represented the 13th District here in the Detroit area. And I think it was very timely that on Juneteenth, this debate was resurrected in Congress. Those of us who had an opportunity to check it out today over C-SPAN and over the internet and so forth, it was a pretty interesting development. We all, of course, know about Mitch McConnell's statements yesterday, the Republican senatorial leader from Kentucky, who said that no reparations bill, and this is not necessarily a reparations bill, this is a bill to set up a commission to study the feasibility of the implementation of a reparations policy in the United States, which has never, mind you, apologized for the enslavement of Africans for 250 years in this country. Because if they apologize, then that means they have some culpability in regard to what happened. And of course, we're still living with the impact of slavery today. McConnell said yesterday that why should he be responsible for something that happened 150 years ago or more, and all the people that were involved in the enslavement of Africans are dead. Well, he was of course answered today by Ta-Nehisi Coates, as well as Danny Glover and others, even one woman who was a descendant of someone who owns slaves, also spoke out in favor of reparations in the United States. So this is a very, very historic day for several reasons. We want to welcome our friends from the Cuban Caravan. We're going to hear later from Dr. Luis Barrios, who is a board member of the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. And IFCO has a long history with activists here in the city of Detroit. I want to mention, first of all, that Reverend Dr. Lucius Walker was very well known here in the city of Detroit. In fact, in 1969, 50 years ago, in April of that year, IFCO hosted the first National Black Economic Development Conference. It took place at Wayne State University. This is part of what, we might as well say part of Wayne State, but it was held down at the Community Arts Auditorium in late April of 1969. It attracted many, many people from all over the United States. It was a conference designed to discuss the economic and political future of African Americans. In 1969, African American people were in a heightened state of mobilization in the United States. We had a rebellion here in 1967. 1968, there was much political activity in 1969 in Detroit. That same year, we had the founding of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. The year before, the Republic of New Africa was founded here in 1968. So it was appropriate in 1969 to have the National Black Economic Development Conference hosted here in the city of Detroit. And that conference was sponsored by IFCO and Reverend Lucius Walker. That conference is also significant historically because it's the first modern day conference that raised the question of reparations for the enslavement of African people. The Black Manifesto, which came out of that conference, that was written and issued by James Foreman, the late James Foreman, who was previously Executive Secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the International Affairs Director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. He later became, during that time period, an executive board member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, presented the Black Manifesto at the National Black Economic Development Conference in 1969 here at Wayne State University in Detroit. And that conference, as I mentioned before, was hosted by IFCO. So all these things are coming together. We have the hearing today in Capitol Hill. We have the 50th anniversary of the Black Manifesto. And of course, we have the 400th anniversary of the enslavement of African people here in the United States. Also in regard to IFCO, we have, through former Councilwoman Joanne Watson, set up a Doctors for Detroit committee, which has recruited numerous students from the city of Detroit to study medicine at the Latin American School of Medicine over the last decade or more. Many of them have graduated. They are now doing residencies and practicing medicine all across the United States. This is a major contribution by the Republic of Cuba to the oppressed people here in the United States. They are given free scholarships to study medicine at probably the most advanced medical training institute in the world that trains thousands upon thousands of physicians from Africa, from Latin America, and we are honored that the former President Fidel Castro opened up the program in conjunction with Reverend Lucius Walker to mainly oppressed people here in the United States. So we thank the Reverend Dr. Lucius Walker. We thank the late Fidel Castro. We thank the Republic of Cuba for such a gift to the people here in the United States. Briefly, I just want to mention also the role of Cuba in the liberation of Africa, the destruction of white settler colonialism in Southern Africa. Even prior to that, Cuba was involved in the consolidation of the independence of Algeria in 1963 that was attacked by a U.S.-backed invasion led by Morocco in 1963. Many people are not aware of that history, but Cuba sent in military advisors and pilots and so forth. They were able to defeat that intervention and consolidate the independence of Algeria under the leadership of the late President Ben Bella. Cuba was also instrumental in assisting other countries in Africa. Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, Guinea under Ahmed Sékou Touré, providing training for cadres, political as well as military training in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, and Angola. And of course, in 1975, when the racist South African Defense Forces sent troops into southern Angola to halt the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, from consolidating independence there, Cuba sent initially 55,000 of its own troops, all volunteers that went to Angola, fought the South African Defense Forces, and beat them back across the borders to, of course, ensure the independence of Angola in November of 1975. Cuban troops remained there from 1975 to 1988 to ensure the independence of Angola. Also, in a series of critical battles during late 1987 and early 1988, the FAPLA, the military wing of the Republic of Angola, along with the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, which is the armed wing of the Southwest Africa People's Organization of Namibia, and the Cuban Internationalist Forces, along with Mkonto Wesizwe, the ANC military wing, defeated the South African Defense Forces, particularly in a battle around Quito, Cuanavale. This broke the teeth, as Fidel Castro said, of the racist military forces of the South African Defense Forces. As a result of that defeat, the South Africans realized that militarily they could not defeat the liberation movements. There was a negotiated transition for the withdrawal of the South African Defense Forces from southern Angola, the withdrawal of the South African Defense Forces from Namibia, which they had occupied since the conclusion of World War I, and to negotiate with the African National Congress for the end of apartheid in South Africa. So Cuba was essential in the liberation of Southern Africa, the destruction of white minority rule in that region of the world. Today, Cuba is doing a lot of good work in Africa still. In West Africa, 4 or 5 years ago, when the Ebola virus disease outbreak took place, Cuba sent hundreds of its healthcare workers into a very dangerous and toxic atmosphere. And they played a critical role in arresting the Ebola virus disease pandemic of 2014 and 2015 during that time period in Sierra Leone and Liberia, as well as Guinea-Conakry. Recently, Cuba has sent healthcare workers, aid workers to the Republic of Mozambique that was hit by 2 tremendous cyclones, Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth, that killed hundreds of people, that destroyed property all over Mozambique, parts of Malawi, as well as Zimbabwe. And they were commended for their work, not only by the people of Mozambique, but also by the international community in general. So we are forever grateful to the Cuban Revolution for these contributions to African people and oppressed people throughout the world. So right now, do we have Julia's on the line, and hopefully we can have your undivided attention. Julia is from the Detroit area. She is currently studying at American University in Beirut, Lebanon. She is a brigadista that's going to be a part of the Venceremos Brigade later this year, along with Jonathan Roberts here, as well as George Vitus. They are going to Cuba. And we have 2 veterans of the Venceremos Brigade, the 2nd Brigade of 1970, Jerry Goldberg and David Soul are here too. So this is a intergenerational. Let's have a warm welcome for Julia.
Yeah. 1983.
All right.
Brigade.
A 3rd one here. Daryl. Okay.
She's on the line, but we're gonna try again.
Get her through.
It is very late. I believe it's something like 2 or 3 a.m. So she was staying up very late since 5 our time to prepare for this.
While we're waiting, I just want to remind people that this is a fundraiser for the Cuba Caravan, so any donations would be more than welcome, and they will go to our visitors here.
Where do we put the donations out, young?
It's a good question. You put them at the table back, oh, somebody has a jar there, we can
Please leave a message.
pass
It's our
around.
50-50 raffle.
And we have a 50-50 raffle as well. No one? Okay, then just donations, all right, fine. Okay. While we're waiting, I also want to mention that we have a resolution that was passed in January by the Detroit City Council that opposes the U.S. embargo against Cuba. We're going to pass out copies of that. We also have a letter from Councilwoman Sheffield, Mary Sheffield, who gave us a letter for the Cuba Caravan guests in support of the Cuba Caravan. She is a daughter of Reverend Horace Sheffield III, who visits Cuba on a regular basis. So we will get to that as well.
Please leave a message.
I don't know if you want to go to something else.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Julia, I want to bring up Jonathan Roberts, who's going to address us. He'll be going to Cuba very soon. He's also went to Puerto Rico back in the fall. The Solidarity delegation invited by the electrical workers in Puerto Rico. Let's have a warm welcome for Jonathan Roberts.
First off, I want to say that I am very honored to be a part of the 50th Brigade. I think it's historic for many reasons, but particularly because we are living in a time where every time we turn on the news, we hear crisis after crisis after crisis. And insofar as we live in a time where we are realizing the failings of capitalism and how this economic system isn't sustainable for communities like Detroit, for communities like Puerto Rico, nations like Cuba, nations like Venezuela, who are attacked because of their confrontation with capitalism. It's important to know that this is a campaign that's being battled on both an economic front and an ideological front. So we couldn't have, in Detroit, for example, a mayor who is championed for tearing down homes as people have been displaced from their homes, as people now are homeless because of illegal actions done by a government. That can't take place if there's not an ideological framework that can justify it. You can't justify denying water, a fundamental human right, to children, to families. Regardless of whether they're children, families, adults, everyone requires water. So to shut off water is irrational, which means that there must be some ideological basis for a government, for private companies to even be allowed to make such an action. And we can go on with this list in Puerto Rico, the fact that their debt has ballooned to a point where not even the United States could pay off the debt in Puerto Rico, the continental United States. It's well over $60 billion on an island nation which really only had a debt service of maybe about $4 or $5 billion. But just like in Detroit, you had banks and financial institutions which were able to prey on the most vulnerable people. Again, that all goes back to ideology. So as we talk about why has there been this long-standing blockade in Cuba, why is it that the United States, no matter what era we are in, is constantly starting war and inciting violence in the global south? It's because they are afraid. They are afraid of something that isn't war, it's not conflict, it's an idea. It's the most dangerous idea possible for capitalism. It's the most dangerous idea possible for the United States as a political entity. And that idea is that working people, that black and brown people can, without the wealthy, without the political elites, organize collectively, that they can self-determine, that they can solve issues like water affordability, they can solve issues like housing, they can solve issues of the environment, they can solve issues of job security, of elderly in the retirement. They can do all of those things without interference from those that have wealth, from those that have capital. Because if that idea is true, which I believe it is, and we all know that it is, then the legitimacy of our economic institutions, the legitimacy of the United States government is in peril. So I think it's necessary, especially now that it's so easy for us to look at figureheads in power and call them, idiotic or irrational or whatever words we have, depending on the statements that are being made that particular day. It almost feels like we're living in a farce of a political system, but we've always been living in a farce.
That's right.
This land has never been the United States to begin with. Cuba has never been a colony of the United States as much as we've tried to make it one. Puerto Rico has never been a colony of the United States as much as we tried to make it one. The global South, Latin America, as many interventions as we've made, it's not ours to take, it's not ours to fight over. I wish Julia were on the call. She has, so many perspectives. We've talked a lot about her time as she's studying in Beirut, and just seeing what it means to have people who have been living with war that's been instigated by a foreign government for their entire lives. You have children who will only grow up knowing war, just as in this country, in this city, you have children who will grow up with never having water in their household, never having food readily available on tables. That's the future that we're promising families. That's the future that we're promising those who come after us. And it's not a future that's sustainable. I think we all know this system is on its last leg, but that's when it becomes the most violent. And that's when it's